Have you ever heard a scary story in the news about postpartum psychosis, a parent, a mom harming her child or herself 1 to 2 years after giving birth? Have you ever thought, how do I know that that won't be me, especially if you have a history of PTSD? Do you just want to understand what postpartum psychosis is and how we think about it in the mental health world? If you've ever had thoughts like this, if you're a post-traumatic parent and you worry, will my damage my children? And then you hear a scary story in the news where a parent did harm her children and you worry, what does that mean for me and my PTSD? Hi, welcome. We're post-traumatic parents and we get it too. I'm Dr. Robin Koslowitz, YouTube's post-traumatic parenting expert. And today we're going to talk about, what do post-traumatic parents need to know about postpartum psychosis? What is postpartum psychosis? What do I have to be worried about? And what are postpartum mood disorders in general? But first, if this is a topic that interests you, if this is something that you like to talk about or that you need to learn about, please click subscribe below so you never miss another episode. So let's understand postpartum psychosis, what it is, and also what it isn't, particularly for those of us with PTSD. When we hear a story of a parent harming her child, and we've had the intrusive thought of, will my damage my children? Stories like that can be very triggering. Now, this particular video, just as a disclaimer, is not about any one particular story, although there have been some well-publicized stories in the news recently. I think the one that people remember the most is Andrea Yates, which actually happened so many years ago, but people still remember it, where in the throes of a psychotic episode, a mom can harm herself or her child due to the delusions or psychotic thinking that postpartum psychosis causes. So this is not about any one particular incident. This is just, let's really understand postpartum psychosis, postpartum mood disorders, and what post-traumatic parents especially need to know about them. So the first thing we need to know about postpartum psychosis is extremely, extremely rare. It affects about 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 women who have a baby. So that means 998 women who have a baby, only 1 to 2 of them might have some symptoms of postpartum psychosis. Now, that's a very, very, very small amount. And within that very, very, very small amount of women, only about 4% have thoughts or have acted on thoughts of actually harming or killing their baby, and 5% have attempted suicide. 5% of the 1 to 2 out of 1,000. So that's very, very few. That being said, when someone is experiencing any sort of symptom, any intrusive thoughts, we're going to go into what the symptoms are, we need to take it very, very seriously, because it is eminently treatable as long as the proper steps are taken relatively quickly. In fact, immediately, the instant that the symptoms start occurring. Mostly postpartum psychosis occurs in women who have had a prior life experience of psychosis, meaning they had an incident of psychosis before they got pregnant, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder, and particularly bipolar 1. When you have a history or a family history of these conditions, most people do know this, so it's important to be monitored by a physician, a psychiatrist, mental health professional. There needs to be a care team who manages that, because postpartum psychosis can strike very quickly and the signs are sometimes easy to miss. We want to make sure that a woman who has a family history of any of those things already is being monitored so that any problems are caught very, very, very quickly, because very often it's a matter of couple of nights in the hospital, a change in meds, and everything's okay, averting the kind of tragedy that could happen. So it's important to remember that postpartum psychosis, like all postpartum mood disorders, postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, what we call perinatal mood disorders, are eminently treatable, and it is worth getting the help, even if you're not at the level where you're having intrusive thoughts about harming yourself or the baby, but you're just anxious all the time, on edge and irritable all the time. Your thoughts won't stop racing. You can't stop crying. You can't summon up energy and interest in getting out of bed or in taking care of yourself. Maybe you can only take care of the baby, but you're completely forgetting about yourself. When I was on internship, I worked in a hospital and I worked in a women's clinic, and there was a woman who reported, like right after giving birth to her baby, losing all interest in eating and losing something like 80 pounds in a couple of weeks. That's extremely dangerous. And she had only interest, obsessive interest, in watching her baby, guarding her baby, thinking about her baby 24/7. Sometimes it's the opposite. No interest in the baby at all because there's this depressive feeling, there's no energy. Maybe there's a thought like this baby would be better off with anybody else as a parent except for me. There is help out there. And it is so important to get the help with no shame and no stigma. I run a lot of parenting classes, and I'm saying this is coming from my heart because I have heard new parents with PTSD, because that is my specialty. Post-traumatic parenting is my specialty. In a lot of parenting classes, I've heard people talk about their struggles where in the past they struggled in silence with something that was so eminently treatable. And many, many mothers have told me about having intrusive thoughts and being so afraid to tell anybody about those intrusive thoughts. And what are intrusive thoughts? Intrusive thoughts are thoughts that seem to come out of nowhere. And those thoughts are, you just can't ignore them. They come. It's almost like the voice of like a higher power talking to you, like God or an angel is talking to you, not in a delusional way, but just like it's like a voice, like a billboard, something just like coming out of nowhere. Thoughts like, it's too bad I'm not dead. He would be better off with a different mother than me. I wonder what would happen if I took this electrical cord and wrapped it around my baby's neck. I just want to get in a car and drive away, and like my husband will think I died and I'll leave him with the kids and I'll have just disappeared. Thoughts about a baby being evil, thoughts about a baby, particularly thoughts about how I might accidentally harm my baby. These are very common thoughts in postpartum anxiety, in postpartum OCD, and sometimes in postpartum PTSD. Now here's the thing, I want to understand the etiology of this because I think it's really important to know how this happens. So let's say we have, and we'll get back into like the actual postpartum psychosis soon, because that's a very, very, very specific case that really does not affect many people. But we need to raise awareness both within mothers who are having babies for the first time and maybe are startled by the strength of their thoughts, family members so they can keep eyes out for signs of this, friends, neighbors, so everybody knows what these conditions are so that we can support one another. Any pre-existing mental health condition that someone might have, OCD, anxiety, PTSD, psychosis, bipolar, you name it, can be re-triggered and exacerbated by childbirth for a couple of reasons. One reason, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of like the endocrine system and the hormones and all of that, but rapidly shifting hormone levels is very stressful for your brain. So when someone has a baby, there's a rapid surge in estrogen. A lot of hormones are changing. There's a surge in oxytocin. There's a waning of oxytocin, right? There's a lot of like chemicals come and go, and your brain is sometimes struggling to keep up with that. So any pre-existing mental health condition that you had can be triggered. I've had many patients call me in the postpartum period, and a postpartum period, by the way, can be till your baby's 5. they'll call me and they'll say, you know, like, I had panic disorder. I was better. Like, I was fine. I like said, oh, I am better. I am ready to like get married and have a baby and move on with my life. And, you know, I'm good now. And now, I don't know, I had a baby 9 months ago and my panic attacks are suddenly back out of the clear blue sky from one moment to the next. What happened? Very likely what happened was brain chemistry was altered, and the meds that worked, the meds that were safe to take during pregnancy, the meds that were safe to take during nursing are not as effective, and something needs to be like rejiggered a little bit. Like, not a big deal, not that hard. It can be done, but it means get to your psychiatrist sooner rather than later, and maybe come back into therapy for a little while to sort of re-up your skills on dealing with panic attacks, because it's difficult to parent while having panic attacks. It's the exact same thing with OCD, with social anxiety, with depression, with PTSD symptoms. They can resurge because of the way hormones and medications intersect, because of the way hormones and mood intersect. So if you're experiencing any sort of reason distress, rather than, because so many, especially post-traumatic parents, take so much responsibility on ourselves. I'm doing it wrong. This is my fault. I'm not doing whatever my mental hygiene plan was for managing my OCD, panic attacks, depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar, whatever it is. I'm doing it wrong. This is on me. And then it's like scary to then go to a professional because now you're taking the blame on yourself. But this is your hormones. And this is a medical problem that can have a medical solution. So that is issue number one, that we don't fully understand the endocrine system. We don't fully understand how hormones work. I will tell you that some of the smartest researchers, when I was doing research in grad school, some of the smartest researchers I ever intersected with, were the endocrinologists, because the endocrine system is so confusing and so difficult to predict and understand that you really, I feel like they are the smartest doctors. And the thing that every endocrinologist who's been doing research will tell you, number one, is we don't fully understand this. So do not take the blame on yourself. If these brilliant doctors don't fully get why this is happening, you for sure cannot fully get why this is happening. Go seek out psychiatric care, change your meds. Yeah, this medicine worked for you for 10 years, but it's not working now. So go and rejigger it. Figure it out. It's figure outable. That is issue number one. Issue number two is babies and sleep are not compatible. After you have a baby, it is very hard to sleep. Number one, the little creature is up a lot in the middle of the night. They cry, as they should, because they're little biological creatures who need to be fed and changed and held and burped, and this new world that they're in is not cozy and comfy like the womb. It's confusing and it's big and it's cold and it's loud and it's noisy. Right? And every so often, even as the baby gets older, there are sleep regressions as they go through new stages. Just when you think you figured out the baby's schedule, something happens, they get sick, or they get a growth spurt and they suddenly need to be fed every hour. They get a diarrhea and, you know, and suddenly you have to change a diaper every hour. These things happen. It is exhausting. Now, I will tell you an experience that happened to me. Now, I do not have postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis, but I do have PTSD. And I was shocked at how my PTSD, especially my flashbacks, came roaring back after I had my babies. Especially my oldest daughter, when I had her, my PTSD that had really been well resolved for a very long time just got re-triggered in my brain and reawoken. And one of the things that happened was I had terrible insomnia because I had all of these intrusive thoughts that my baby was going to suddenly die. My father suddenly died in the middle of the night, so it makes sense. I was very afraid to sleep. In fact, I remember telling my mother-in-law, a very experienced mother, that my baby, that it was so hard because I kept having to wake my baby up to get her to nurse in the middle of the night. And my mother-in-law said to me, "Why are you waking her up?" I said, "What do you mean? I need to nurse her." And my mother-in-law was like, "The point is you want the baby eventually to like sleep for longer and longer stretches and not wake up to feed in the middle of the night. Like, she's supposed to do that." But I would panic if she didn't wake up, so I would wake her up to make sure she was okay. Very common in PTSD, your flashbacks will come back, or likely to come back. And I've heard this more and more and more. It's not talked about enough in the literature. Your flashbacks might come back in the immediate postpartum, and even like, you know, a year or two after a baby, your flashbacks might come back. Your PTSD might get worse. You might have intrusive thoughts. Like, I was having intrusive thoughts of my baby dying suddenly the way my father died. because I loved my baby so much that thought, it would just come and it would replay and replay, so much so that like I remember Googling how to do baby CPR in middle of the night and like keeping like printing it out and like having it near me, because any minute now. And the horribleness of that thought, like, is my baby breathing? Is she breathing? Is she breathing? Is she breathing? As I'm saying this, I'm going like onto the internet and saying this for people to hear, because I want to normalize what intrusive thoughts are. They're horrible because you can't get away from your own brain, right? If there's annoying music playing in a store, you can leave the store. If there's annoying music playing on the radio, you know, in your car, if you're listening to a podcast and an annoying jingle comes on, you can switch that off. You can't switch your own brain off. Well, you can, but it involves chemicals that are not compatible with childcare. So you really can't do that. I remember so clearly, and remember, I was a graduate student at that point. I was in a master's program. I was doing research. I am an intelligent person who is well-spoken and articulate and able to explain myself. I remember going to a doctor and talking about this insomnia that I was having, and the doctor was so dismissive. In fact, he called in the other doctor, who was also a man. He called them both in, and he was like, "You're not going to believe this. First time I've ever heard this. New mom with insomnia. Ever heard of such a thing? A new mother who says that even when her baby's sleeping, she can't fall asleep." And they were chuckling, "Oh, don't worry, you'll crash. It's like, you'll be fine." You know, they did say like, "It's your hormones," but like in this way that felt very dismissive and patronizing. I was a new mother and I wasn't sleeping. And that is a very risky place to be. Now, yeah, we are going back to 2000. So we're going back 25 years ago, 24 years ago, maybe it was 99, 2000. We're going back a very, very, very long time. I think medical care has advanced. I hope nobody will go into a doctor and hear that level of patronizing dismissiveness that I got. But the fact is that sleep is a mood stabilizer. And without sleep, it's really hard to parent. It's really hard to get through your day. And if there's already a pre-existing mental health condition and you're not sleeping, that's all it takes to trigger you right back into there. So yeah, your OCD was really under control for a long time, and then you have a colicky baby for 3 months, your OCD might come back. Now, when we're dealing with bipolar disorder, psychosis, schizophrenia, where there can be delusions, there can be command hallucinations where somebody hears a statement about harming herself or her baby, that is just much, much more risky. So if you know that there's a family history of bipolar disorder, your mom has it, your maternal aunt had it, your grandma had it, you had an incident in high school and then you were better very quickly, you know, this is something to really monitor and keep an eye out for. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have babies, and that doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. That doesn't mean anything. It just means the instant you have the first intrusive thought, run to the psychiatrist. And when we're talking about the symptoms that we're looking for in postpartum psychosis, we're looking for irritability, we're looking for mood swings, insomnia, even when you would normally be able to sleep, like the baby's sleeping, there's, you know, somebody watching the baby and you could fall asleep, you still can't sleep, racing thoughts, intrusive thoughts of self-harm or harming a baby. Hallucinations are, you know, seeing things that aren't there. Sometimes it's like, the way a hallucination is, I remember when I was on internship in a hospital, a patient of mine, and we're going to talk about her story in a minute because I think it's very instructive, telling me that her auditory hallucination sounded like someone was playing the radio in another room. Like she said, like, you know how you're talking to me right now and you're, you know, asking me questions? So imagine you were next door. So I would hear you, but not perfectly clearly. But I hear enough that if I really strain my ears, I can hear everything the person's saying. And like right then we were in an office in a, you know, big psychiatric hospital where like the funding wasn't amazing and the walls were a little thin and you could hear the muffled sounds of the meeting going on in the office next door. And if you strained, you could hear a word here or there. She's like, that sounds like what a hallucination sounded like to me. And then sometimes it got louder and louder till it sounded like you are talking to me like right now. She would have what we call ideas of reference, where you see a word or a sentence on a billboard and you think it's talking about you or your life. in this particular person's case, her psychotic thinking about angels and demons, and you know, and needing to protect her children from angels and demonic forces and all sort, you know, that was the content of her hallucinations. Thankfully, she knew that those were hallucinations. So those are the symptoms that you're really, really looking out for. And I feel like it is imperative on, if you don't understand what symptoms you should be looking out for, you need to sit down with your psychiatrist and get a very, very, very detailed list and really know what to keep an eye on. And perhaps your loved ones, perhaps your husband, perhaps your best friend, perhaps your grandmother, your mother, your sister, your next door neighbor, whoever is helping you parent, whoever your support system is, those people need to know the signs. That doesn't mean you need to think about the signs and obsessively check off the signs, but those people need to know the signs so that you have checks and balances to know, like, oh, this is getting difficult. Please, if you are having intrusive thoughts, if any psychiatric condition is reasserting itself during the postpartum period, and like I said, postpartum period can be until your kid is 5, because again, we don't understand hormones. Go to your doctor, admit it. But I've had so many young mothers tell me that it's really scary to admit to intrusive thoughts. I had a patient who had OCD, and she was telling me, I'm sorry, scratch that, take out the I had a patient. I had a young mother in one of my post-traumatic parenting classes tell me that her OCD came back. Her trauma was that she had OCD, and her, like, the fact that her brain was betraying her was very traumatic, and it made it really hard to parent. And she would have these intrusive thoughts about harming her baby, to the point where she would feel the need to, like, go downstairs in the middle of the night and, like, lock up all the knives in her house, because what if she would sleepwalk and get a knife and stab her baby? But she was terrified to tell anyone. She didn't tell her psychiatrist, even when her psychiatrist asked her straight out, are you having intrusive thoughts? And she knows what intrusive thoughts are. She was terrified to tell her husband. She did not want to tell anybody. When she told me in a post-traumatic parenting class, it was so many years after she had those thoughts. That baby was like 10 now. And she still was shaking with fear saying it. She said because she was so afraid that everybody in the class, when she said it out loud, when she had the courage to say it out loud, she was so afraid that we would all judge her and think horrible things about her. And of course, we were all very supportive, and we were all sharing that we've had intrusive thoughts. And it is so scary to say I'm having intrusive thoughts, which is one of the reasons why people don't get help. You should know that intrusive thoughts are just thoughts. Anybody who understands mental health knows that it's a thought, and knows that if you're coming into the hospital and you're telling a doctor, I'm having intrusive thoughts about killing myself, I'm having intrusive thoughts about hurting my baby, they are not going to lock you up and throw away the key. They're going to change your meds. Like, that's what's going to happen in most appropriate scenarios. This is something that the mental health system is trained to do. Now, are there people who are better and worse? Sure. Like I said, my story with, postpartum insomnia, and the way the doctor just laughed at me made me feel like an idiot. It made me feel like, why should I tell anyone that I'm dealing with this? I just have to tough it out and figure it out. When the fact is, the less sleep I was getting, the more flashbacks I was getting, the less sleep I was getting. And this was particularly bad when my second daughter was born, because she was a very poor sleeper. She was what they call a colicky baby. So between me having this insomnia and her never, ever, ever sleeping, I never slept. And that was bad, because that could have been dangerous, and I did deserve help, and I didn't get the help back then, and I didn't know how to advocate for myself. So I am posting this video so anybody who is post-traumatic, who hears this, and the particular trauma we're talking about now is, you're a post-traumatic parent if you have a past history of any sort of psychiatric condition that was traumatic for you. So let's say you had OCD and your brain betrayed you. You had social anxiety and your body betrayed you. You had panic attacks and your heart rate betrayed you. That is in and of itself a trauma. And after you've resolved that condition, you sometimes have to also resolve the traumatic effects it left in its wake, because it's a horrible feeling to feel your own body or your own brain betray you. It is a horrible feeling. I know from PTSD flashbacks, it is a horrible feeling to hallucinate, right? With a flashback, you're not actually hallucinating, but you are seeing things that aren't there. That's a horrible feeling. That being said, help is out there. I'm making it sound bad. Help is out there. And it is not that difficult to get the help because we are educating professionals more and more. And here's why I'm going to say don't suffer in silence. Don't suffer in silence, not only because don't suffer in silence, because why suffer? Don't suffer in silence because as you're suffering in silence, you're supposed to be being an attachment figure for your baby. And it's very hard to be attuned to a baby's needs and provide that loving, steady parental presence when you're having panic attacks all the time, when you're not sleeping, when your heart is racing, when you're constantly battling intrusive thoughts. Really hard to then be the attachment figure for this baby. And then you're going to feel guilt and shame, which is going to make it worse. And then that becomes a trauma in and of itself. Whereas, so sometimes, if you really want to tough it out, and you're 16 years old, and you're having panic attacks like I was, and you're like, no, I'm going to do it myself because I'm going to tough it out because trauma gives us that hyper independent, mindset where I'm going to handle this on my own. Okay. But now you're an attachment figure. So don't tough it out when the help is out there, when between medication and psychotherapy and getting more support, things can turn around so rapidly. You can feel so much better so quickly that it's just worth it. It's worth it for you. It's worth it for the baby. So if you're having that thought, my poor baby, any mother would be better than me, that's an intrusive thought. That can be dealt with. That's not you speaking. That's a postpartum intrusive thought speaking. And that can be handled. Don't battle it on your own because the help is out there. In terms of understanding postpartum psychosis and particularly infanticide, like stories in the news that we hear, I want us to understand, for example, Andrea Yates, right? Andrea Yates was found not guilty by reason of insanity for the death of her 4 children. Let's understand that when somebody commits a violent crime in the throes of a mental health episode and, a severe psychotic episode, let's understand that that person is not acting of their own free will. They're acting in accordance with the delusion. I'm sure a lot of us have watched sci-fi movies about alternative futures, but I remember watching a sci-fi movie once about an alternative future where people had these implantable chips in their brain, and the implantable chip would let you be sort of do something in virtual reality, and you would see things differently, almost like an Instagram filter, except it's on the world around you. So your house might be broken down and falling apart, but you click a button on the chip and it looks like this gorgeous mansion that the Kardashians would live in. And it's great because your life is better because you don't see that your house is actually hideous. It looks pretty. And this was a dystopian future where people had these chips. And of course there was this evil hacker who hacked somebody to think that his wife and child were intruders in his house. And then the guy, he thought they were robbers coming to kill his family, and he shot the robber, except the robber was his wife and his child. Would we say that that person is culpable of murder? Would we say, oh my God, lock him up, throw away the key? No. Yes, he did in fact kill his wife and child, but he did so upon the delusion that he was protecting them from a threat. Now, it's still terrible if when someone can do something very violent in the throes of a delusion, so yeah, they may end up in an institution, in a protective institution to keep themselves and the world safe. But we don't look at that culpability as that person, it's not the same thing as waking up one morning and being I just can't stand my boss. She's a jerk. I'm going to put some poison in her coffee, right? That's premeditated murder. This is something very, very different. My concern about the moral outrage when a story of postpartum psychosis where a woman's mental health challenges are ignited by the postpartum period and now she harms herself or her baby or both, the moral outrage that sparks, my fear is will that moral outrage, that lack of understanding, the very big difference in culpability between my boss was mean, I'm putting poison in her coffee, to I thought my baby was inhabited by a demon and I needed to squeeze the demon out of him, and in the throes of my delusion I didn't notice that I was also killing him, are very, 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 very different. A lot of people with postpartum psychosis will have ideas of reference that include religious ideation, sometimes even in people without a strong history of religious observance. But it's like sort of the place the delusion goes. Demons, angels, God are telling me, not because the religion made them do it, because the delusions made them do it. And when we have that moral outrage of like, they killed a baby, lock them up and throw away the key, a woman who herself is struggling with intrusive thoughts might say, I am never, ever telling anyone about these thoughts. I need to suffer in silence. Because you hear the moral outrage and then I'm not admitting that I've had a thought like that. So that's what this kind of rhetoric, the harm that this kind of rhetoric does. There recently was an incident in my neighborhood where there was a case of infanticide. I don't know the specifics of the case, it's not my patient, but there was a commentator who was talking about the evilness and lock her up and throw away the key. And the commentator themselves said, what woman in her right mind would hurt her baby? Right. Did you just hear yourself? Did you just hear what you yourself just said? What woman in her right mind? This was a woman not in her right mind. It's important. And I'm not saying that about this particular case because I don't know this particular case. I'm saying this in general. But that thinking of what woman in her right mind, coming in that angry moralistic sense, delusional disorders are delusional. And mental health disorders are disorders. And mental illness is illness. Just like we're not going to blame someone for having a stroke or cancer. We can't blame someone for having mental illness. We can, certainly blame someone who perhaps is being told be on meds and then they stop taking their meds. Especially if they've been warned, there's a certain level of what happened there, but you can't say that someone who commits a murder when they're deluded, like I said with the sci-fi video, the man who assumed that he was facing an intruder when it was fact his wife and child, ironically killed his wife and child thinking he was saving them. This is the kind of thing where, and a lot of times if you hear women with postpartum psychosis talking, they're killing their baby to save them from an evil world, to save them from demonic possession, because God said that this child belongs in heaven now. This is actually in a very deluded and very, and very difficult to understand for people who are not experiencing this. It's a protective instinct that is being warped by a hallucination. In my case, when I worked in a psychiatric hospital, I had a young mother who was starting to experience psychosis. She had had a history of psychosis, and she had said to me in this very calm, blah voice, like, yeah, it's very stressful, but that's okay. The stress will soon be over. Thankfully, as her, being a therapist, I was able to say to her, what do you mean by that? The stress will soon be over. Now, sometimes someone says that to you, right? Your friend says, oh yeah, it's so stressful now. The stress will soon be over. And you assume it means, yeah, any minute now it's summer vacation and like my kids won't have to get up for their school buses, or like, the spring rush in my business will end. And she just very calmly said, yeah, I had a premonition that I'm going to kill my kids and then they'll be dead and they'll be in a better world. Thankfully, we were in a psychiatric hospital, so I was literally able to walk her upstairs for a psych consult. Like I was able to just literally walk her to the psychiatry department, knock on a psychiatrist's door and say, hi, meet my patient. Let's talk, right? And and we were able to get a support system immediately in place. So that doesn't always happen. What is important to know, though, that raising moral panic about these conditions is going to make more women not seek out help. So let's understand that postpartum psychosis can end in tragedy. And the more we create hysteria around it, the less people will feel comfortable going for help. If you're a post-traumatic parent, if stories about postpartum psychosis scare you because you know what it feels like to have your brain betray you in some way. If you've ever had the thought, will my damage my kids? Not to the extent of postpartum psychosis, but just to the extent of, I have trauma. How is that going to impact my children? Hi, we get it. We've been there. We're post-traumatic parents too. Please click subscribe below so you never miss another episode. Check out the post-traumatic parenting community. We hang out at Instagram at Dr. Kozlowitz Psychology. If you want to hear my interviews with experts about post-traumatic parenting, check out the Post-Traumatic Parenting Podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. And stay tuned for the Post-Traumatic Parenting book coming out next year in 2025 from Broadleaf. And if you have any thoughts about this episode, please comment below. If you have any questions or ideas for future episodes, please ask them in the comment section below so that we can start a dialogue. Some of the best videos were sparked by questions from people like you. Till next time.